In the last section, we talked about what happens at the onset of exercise and how we really need the anaerobic metabolism pathways to kick in enough ATP to get us through at least a couple minutes or so until we can reach steady state where our oxygen consumption or our aerobic pathways can meet the ATP demand. We're going to expand on that just a little bit farther here in this next video. So this comes from a very classical thought on the idea of oxygen deficit. So the idea is that here we'll just focus on the untrained person here. Again, from rest to exercise, here's our oxygen consumption. Or again, I mentioned in the last one, we could just call it ATP produced from aerobic metabolism. You'll see that here's the ATP we need, here's the ATP we're producing, and there is this gap. Right? So this gap was coined by one of the classic exercise physiologists, A.V. Hill, and what he did is he called this an oxygen deficit. Okay, so the idea was that using these anaerobic pathways put us in negative oxygen because we weren't using enough oxygen oxidative metabolism, and he called this an oxygen deficit, and it provides information about the regulation of oxidative phosphorylation. We'll talk about this deficit and actually what it means and the idea of paying it back here in just a second, but when we look here, one of the things that I'll point out is that trained and untrained are different. So trained subjects have a lower oxygen deficit, right? And this is for a couple reasons. One, they have better cardiovascular adaptations. We'll talk about those in the next unit. One of the cardiovascular adaptations, though, relates also to muscle adaptations. So one, we have better capillarity, so we can get more blood flow there. And two, we have more mitochondria in our muscles so that we can kind of get that inertial momentum that we talked about earlier going a little bit faster and able to provide more ATP with more mitochondria. So therefore, our aerobic metabolism is active earlier and we produce less anabolic or anaerobic byproducts. So if we have a deficit, the other way that we can look at this is call it an oxygen debt. This is a very old school thought, again by A.V. Hill, coined back in the 30s, and the thought was that this oxygen deficit at the beginning caused a debt that we had to repay at the end of exercise, right? And this makes sense for a couple reasons. One, you've experienced it, right? So at the end of exercise, you stop running. How does it usually end? One of my pet peeves, I hate, especially like in the Olympics or some type of track and field, someone just gets done running a race and they come over and they stick a microphone in their face and they're huffing and puffing. They're trying to catch their breath, right? They're still breathing heavy, right? The idea that they're still taking in lots of oxygen because the muscle's needing that oxygen to continue metabolism, and metabolism is still churning and churning, and we're still needing ATP production at a really high rate despite our ATP demand, our metabolic demand is now lower, right? So if we think about it as a energy needing, right? So how much ATP is it to, run this speed? That ATP is no longer needed, right? We've stopped, but we're still generating lots of ATP, especially from this aerobic metabolism. And the old school thought is that we're paying this debt, right? So we're paying for that deficit by consuming more oxygen at the end of exercise to pay back when we weren't able to consume enough. And this still holds a little bit true. There's two ideas that do hold true. One is the rapid phase. It lasts about 2 or 3 minutes. Again, that's the huffing and puffing phase that you've experienced or seen on TV. And you'll see that the rapid phase, I would say, is probably from here to here. Right? So once that then takes over, then we have our slow phase. Our slow phase lasts 30 minutes to a couple of hours. And this is the gross majority. So we have those two principles. However, so we have these two phases that will continue, rapid phase and slow phase, but these we can kind of say are no longer true. right? We now know that this is a little bit different, and what this has actually done is suggested that the field actually go away from the idea of an oxygen deficit and an oxygen debt. Not saying that these don't happen, right? We know that 2 to 3 minutes we huff and puff, and we can look here and we can measure oxygen consumption, and we can see the slow phase that we're still consuming more oxygen after exercise. So how do we then reconcile what we believe is now happening? So what we have now is what we consider Epoc. Epoc stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, and it's often used interchangeably with this oxygen debt. But what we now know is the mechanisms are different. So earlier in that first slide, I said 80% was used to put lactate into gluconeogenesis, but now we know 20% of oxygen debt is used for post-exercise liver gluconeogenesis out of lactate. Okay, so then what are we using these methods for? So here's our Epoc, here's our mechanisms for why Epoc occurs. First, we're resynthesizing phosphocreatine in muscle, right? So we used all of that early on, or a lot of it in the phosphocreatine system early on in that oxygen deficit. So we have to put that phosphate group back on the now bare creatine to make ATP. We also have lactate conversion into glucose, again, gluconeogenesis in the liver, as we talked about. And then we have restoration of muscle and blood oxygen stores. So this is actually in myoglobin. So we're adding oxygen back to myoglobin, which is the oxygen carrier in muscle. So these two are going to be happening in the rapid phase. In the slow phase, we'll put an S here for slow. We have, sorry, this one's also in the fast. So we have a elevation of heart rate and breathing, just increasing our amount of ATP that we need in order to do that. So let me fast. That's much better than. Right, so what's happening in our slow phase is, one, we're converting lactate into glucose via new gluconeogenesis to help restore those in the liver, also happening a little bit in muscle. A couple of the other big players in Epoc is we have elevated hormones. So we'll study this actually at the end of class, but the idea is that the sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight nervous system, as we've learned about, is increased with exercise. This increase in exercise, these actually have effects on our metabolism, just as you might expect, right? And since it's sympathetic, what type of effect is it going to have? It's going to have that speed up effect, right? So it's turning metabolism on, and these hormones are still elevated and in the bloodstream. We also have an elevated body temperature. We've all experienced that, right? So if you go running, then you get hot and you stay heated up. And what that does is, the longer, or as your body heats up, we talked about those enzymes early on, that enzymes are sensitive to both pH and temperature. So if your body is warmer, you actually speed up the activity of those enzymes. You're speeding up the glycolytic enzymes, speeding up the TCA cycle enzymes, speeding up electron transport chain, and therefore metabolism is more rapid. So those are the mechanisms in which we pay that oxygen debt, or probably better termed now, and what most people are using is this excess post exercise oxygen consumption.